Welcome to the 5th Shri M.K. Nambyar Memorial Lecture. It is a great honor for our university to have amongst us Professor Catharine MacKinnon, along with Honorable Justice Rooma Pal, as well as our Vice Chancellor, Professor Dr. P. Ishwara Bhatt. I invite all three dignitaries on stage. The students will now present bouquets to all the dignitaries. To Professor Catharine MacKinnon. To Honorable Justice Rooma Pal. And to our Vice Chancellor, Professor Dr. P. Ishwara Bhatt. I now invite our Vice Chancellor to commence today's program by issuing a welcome address talking about the lecture as well as our Honorable Dignitary Justice Rooma Pal.
Honorable Justice Rooma Pal, Professor Catharine MacKinnon, dignitaries, invitees, students, faculties, and ladies and gentlemen. It gives me great pleasure in welcoming all of you to this 5th Shri M.K. Nambyar Memorial Lecture. This Endowment lecture series was established by Mr. K.K. Venugopal, the present Attorney General of India. Earlier, the lectures were delivered by Justice Michael Kirby, Professor Martha Nussbaum, Professor Mark Galanter, and Justice Togway of Bhutan. It is a wonderful opportunity created by Mr. K.K. Venugopal in the name of his father, M.K. Nambyar. M.K. Nambyar was a very eminent advocate of the Supreme Court. He was from Kerala. In the 1930s, he had his legal education in England. He did his LLM in constitutional and administrative law and stood first and won many prizes in one of the universities in England. He was called to the bar of the Inner Temple. Coming back, he was a public prosecutor in Mangalore in the Madras Presidency. He shifted his practice to Madras under the suggestion of Mr. P. Govindamena. Then he acted as a counsel for various important cases. In a Supreme Court, he represented on behalf of Mr. A.K. Gopalan. In fact, the famous argument that he had put forward was relating to the way in which a procedure established by law under Article 21 is to be interpreted. Regarding his presentation before the court, it is observed by one of the biographers. The constitutional questions that were raised relating to interpretation of Article 21 were new, both to the judges and lawyers. And when Mr. M.K. Nambyar, appearing for the detenue, went on expounding his arguments day after day, citing case law from all over the globe with comparisons between the Indian, the Irish and American constitutions, the entire courtroom seemed to be completely spellbound. There were no interruptions nor questions. The silence in the room broken only by Nambyar's voice and the rustling of the pages of the law reports. His argument that the procedure established by law shall be reasonable was not accepted by the majority, but it was accepted subsequently by the subsequent courts. Only the minority judges of Fazal Ali upheld that proposition. Then his original idea relating to basic structure was put forward in a I.C. Golaknath case. Prior to I.C. Golaknath case, there was a discussion with one German scholar, Professor Conrad, and there was a emergence of this new seed of idea, like a basic structure theory, and the authorship of that idea is thus traced to Mr. M.K. Nambyar. That idea became the majority proposition in the famous Keshavananda case, where 7 judges upheld the argument relating to basic structure, that a basic structure of the constitution cannot be amended. Thus a very substantial contribution has been made by Mr. M.K. Nambyar because of his input of original ideas, especially relating to Article 21 jurisprudence or Article 31 or say about Article 368, etc. His illustrious son, Mr. K.K. Venugopal, at present he is Attorney General. He endowed a substantial amount, and every year we are organizing, and this is the 5th lecture. Of course, his instruction is that a well-known person in the field of public law, a very eminent scholar, should be invited, and all the expenses will be met by the endowment fund. Usually it was his practice to attend and participate in an endowment lecture. This time, because of his earlier commitment to participate in a Constitutional Law Day celebration, he could not come, and he sent one message. Let me read the message. Let me say how gratified I am that Catharine A. MacKinnon has agreed to deliver the 5th M.K. Nambyar Endowment Lecture at the West Bengal National University of Juridical Sciences, Kolkata. I feel quite sad that I am unable to present today at her lecture, as the Law Commission of India is celebrating the Constitution Day, which is being inaugurated by the President of India, since I have to speak at the function. Catharine A. MacKinnon has been described as a groundbreaking activist for women's rights and one of feminism's most significant figures. Her work on eradicating gender inequality has attracted a series of honors being conferred on her. The latest among her books, Butterfly Politics, has excited the interest of academicians and students of law worldwide. We are lucky to have her here in India and to deliver the endowment lecture in my father's name, the late Mr. M.K. Nambyar. We have to be grateful to Mrs. Justice Rumapal, former judge of the Supreme Court of India, for agreeing to preside over the lecture, and to Professor Dr. Ishwar Bhatt, Vice Chancellor of the West Bengal National Institute of Juridical Sciences, for having been able to persuade Professor MacKinnon to travel all the way from the United States to Kolkata to deliver this lecture. Justice Rumapal, who is presiding today's session, and who is coordinating, or who is actually supervising the whole of question and answer session, is well known to NUJS. She was a judge of Supreme Court until her retirement, June 3rd of 2006. After a long and a distinguished career as an advocate. She was appointed a judge in the Calcutta High Court on August 6, 1990. She was further nominated to Supreme Court of India on January 28, 2000, the day of the Golden Jubilee of the court. Justice Pal has delivered many critical judgments in famous cases. She has written on a number of human rights issues. She is also a member of International Forum of Women Judges. Madam Pal had edited many textbooks for legal studies, including a famous book on Indian constitutional law by Professor M.P. Jain, which is considered as an authority. She became the Chancellor of Sikkim University, and she is involving in a number of social service activities and guiding a number of non-profit organizations as well. Her judgments reflect strong feminist viewpoints. On behalf of NUJS, I am heartily welcoming Madam Justice Rumma Pal. When I approached on behalf of the university, Madam Catharine MacKinnon, Madam kindly agreed to come over here from all the way, and our students were also very much excited to listen to the lecture by Madam. Of course, any kind of writing on the gender issues cannot be complete without referring to the works of Catharine MacKinnon. She has a very fine admiration to the Indian law, which has combined both equality and liberty to protect the interests of women. Reacting to the Supreme Court's approach in Daniel Latifi and various other cases, and even in cases relating to rape and other matters, the Supreme Court's approach relating to constitutional feminism is something appreciated by Catharine MacKinnon. On behalf of NUJS, on behalf of this endowment, and personally, I heartily welcome Professor Catharine MacKinnon to this lecture. Today, we have amidst us various dignitaries, Professor B.B. Pandey, Professor Mrinal Satish, Professor Shashikala Gurupur, Professor Vibhute, and Honorable Judges of High Court have been present here, and the faculties and the students, and from various other institutions, as well as from various other organizations, representatives have come to listen to the views of Professor Catharine MacKinnon. She will be speaking on social change through law, butterfly politics. Social change is a very intimate subject for NUJS, both to the students as well as the faculty. On behalf of the university, let me welcome all the persons who have gathered in the audience. Thank you very much.
Madam Justice Rumma Pal, Vice Chancellor Bhatt, honored judges, justices, and guests, faculty, students, and friends. It is a tremendous honor for me to have been chosen to deliver this year's M.K. Nambyar lecture. In particular, I appreciate the generosity of the introduction and also the support for this visit that has been provided by NUJS, both the work of all the people that made this possible. It takes a lot of work to make something look effortless like this. So it's greatly appreciated, and the financial support as well, and not in any way to be taken for granted. I particularly am honored to be able to, and inspired to be able to give a lecture in the tradition of M.K. Nambyar and those who have given it before me. the tradition of connecting practice to theory, of transnational connections, and also the attention to the social consequences of legal change, which oddly is something that is often overlooked. And inspired by this, and actually encouraged by Professor Bhatt in our shared interest in social change through law, I'm going to be speaking with you today about a somewhat fanciful theoretical metaphor that coheres 40 years or more of my legal practice. I have actually written and done a lot of theory. I've also done a lot of practice. What I haven't done before this is theorize my practice. The whole idea of butterfly politics is an attempt to do that, to conceptualize 40-plus years of intervening for social equality through law. That is, some places that this has gone, where it is now, and where it potentially should go, focusing on strategic challenges to gender hierarchy in an attempt to change the realities of sexual abuse on the ground. Through all of this, what I have, among the things I have learned, is that changing the power structure that is involved, that is, in my work, shifting the politics of male dominance, is the power structure that is involved. Focusing on issues of sexual harassment, on rape in and out of genocide, on pornography, and on prostitution and sex trafficking, that this project is a collective one. It is not an individual one. It takes a movement. It's also deeply contextual and grounded. It springs from the realities of social life and relationships, not from any individual person's head. And also it is entirely contingent, meaning that nothing in any of this work has been inevitable, as some on the left would tell you. You know, you can work for a long time to make something happen, and then when you succeed, the left is there to tell you that it was inevitable anyway. Thanks very much. Or that it's impossible, as much of the right imagines as one is doing this work. They are there to tell you it's impossible to change these things, or at least they hope it is. The reason I mention this is that it actually matters what you do. And also, everything is content-based, I've learned, meaning it is substantive. It is not abstract. All these generalizations that people have to make about it, or model building or whatever, actually, when the real process of change is an extremely grounded and concrete and fact-based process. And it all turns on the right intervention, however small. So that's what I'm going to be developing, that thesis. In 1972, when the scientist Konrad Lorenz gave a talk asking, does the flap of a butterfly's wings in Brazil set off a tornado in Texas? When he answered yes, he created the idea of the butterfly effect. It charmingly models how some extremely small, simple actions, properly targeted, can come to have highly complex and large, even cataclysmic, transformative effects worlds away in certain contexts. According to the larger theory of which this is a part, which is chaos theory, according to its understanding of complex causality in dynamic, unstable systems. Actually, weather, for example, is predicted far more accurately these days as a result of applying chaos theory. So butterfly politics means that the right small intervention in an unstable political system can ultimately produce large, complex reverberations leading to transformative systemic change. And given that male dominance has been regarded as being as inevitable as weather, and also that we've actually changed the weather more than we've changed male dominance, it seemed to me there was a certain symmetry here. Butterfly politics is one way to understand how strategic intervention can produce systemic transformation in the gender system. The butterfly metaphor highlights some crucial dimensions of legal political activism, including the domain of the action, the strategic choice of moments of intervention, dynamics of intervention, including blowback, the collaborative effects of collective repetition, and the simultaneity of retrospective and prospective causality. The butterfly effect in my book, the new book on this subject, metaphorically organizes activist advocacy. Much of it, the first time an idea that is now fairly familiar showed its face in public. And almost none of this has ever been published before. So these are just me actually standing up and doing a thing that turned out to be a butterfly moment. That is, the butterfly moment, the small perturbation, the local disturbance, the consequences of which turned out to be variously large. And I'm going to be tracing some of those in examples today. So as to the nature of the domain, if any social system is complex and unstable, it is sex inequality. It is complex, among other reasons, because of its simultaneously multiple interacting variables within it, prominently including race, ethnicity, religion, class, caste, disability, sexuality, and age, all of which do a lot of their work through gender, and gender does a lot of its work through them. Gender also, by the way, of course, analyzes men as well as women, meaning we're talking about everyone here. It isn't just women that have a gender. Intrinsically unstable this system is, not the least because it is predicated on a lie. The lie is of women's natural inferiority to men and men's natural superiority to women, typically termed difference in ideological, legal, and common parlance. Life, actually, everyday life, given half a chance, refutes this lie every day, which means it takes a lot of force to hold it together. This system for structuring and distributing power, this particular hierarchy of status and power, the fact that it is a hierarchy of status and power makes it be political. That is, power-structured relationships. In the face of evidence and actually some resistance to its false basis, and even some acknowledgement of its injustice, gender inequality has proven extremely tenacious. It is highly stable. Its particular genius is it is always shifting ground to adapt to new forces and new challenges, but the hierarchy remains. So obviously, for this, the idea of changing in this to work, you have to accurately identify the social content of the system in which the legal intervention is being contemplated. So what is the equivalent here of the air that the butterfly moves when it flexes its wings? In identifying this domain, much work for sex equality has largely failed. Or I think actually it has addressed mainly symptoms, which do need addressing, but they don't go to the foundation. Conventional approaches usually don't face the key dynamic of inequality, which is hierarchy. An interactive, symbiotic, top-down, bottom-up dynamic. It's not just a two-cell table, you know, with some people up here and some people down there. It's an interactive, dynamic, always in motion system. Sexism is then the hierarchy of men over women and some other men. So men over men is included in this analysis, as well as men over women with gender dynamics involved, in particular, say, prominently, gay men. In white supremacist societies, men of color. In caste societies, de-notified or lower caste men. There are gender dynamics to this, is what I'm saying. Conventional approaches haven't addressed either a key lived site of the operation of the dynamics of male dominance, in my view, which is sexuality. Legal strategies that prefer to contend with dynamics that are not what are driving things, namely sexuality, on terrain which is not where it is principally being driven, because that produces less opposition or is more pleasing to be activist about, or it's easier to win cases. But the question is, what have you won when you've won them? You can do some things with this, but you can't fundamentally alter those dynamics, especially when they are as structurally entrenched as these are. By analogy, weather models wouldn't work either if scientists ignored small, consistent rises in global temperature because they just didn't like thinking about climate change. So dominant approaches to inequality have misdiagnosed the nature of this system, including treating, what it's done is treat the social status quo baseline as if that is natural. In other words, the inequality that is built into society gets treated as natural, something that itself cannot be questioned. And prominently also, we see the gaslighting of survivors of sexual abuse. People here know what gaslighting is? Yes, no? Okay, there's an old movie, and in it, awful things are being done to a woman, and there are people all around her telling her that these things are not being done. In other words, it's about making you crazy for believing the reality that you actually experience. Okay, so the dynamic of gaslighting sexual survivors, or that is survivors of sexual abuse, is telling them it didn't really happen. If it did, you're just too sensitive to it. It didn't really hurt you as much as you think it did. Actually, you consented to it, meaning you really wanted it. That's called gaslighting, right? Now, while this has gone on, some of the most substantial changes made in sex inequality through law have occurred through unconventional, that is, this ignoring of all of that. Some of these large changes have occurred through really unconventional and unprecedented approaches and arguments, typically with absolutely no institutional backing in very small locales, specifically, actually, by me. The legal claim for sexual harassment, for example, initiated in the United States and now worldwide, with the full theory of substantive equality embedded in it and growing out of it, shows this whole dynamic in high relief. And as you can see today, the chaos theory prediction that there would be a cyclone eventually of this is actually taking place worldwide right now with the Me Too hashtag and so on. Now, this claim saw through the basic equality theory that Aristotle has bequeathed the world, and people have just used it without questioning it mostly ever since, although actually the Supreme Court of India has done a better job than Aristotle did, and so has the Supreme Court of Canada. But this sexual harassment legal claim saw that Aristotle's idea that equality means likes, treating likes alike and unalike, namely formal equality, is never going to produce equality for women, especially since women are socially defined as different from men. Okay, now plug that in, and you understand why one doesn't get equality through conventional legal approaches. Sexual harassment law replaced this approach with substantive equality, which as a general approach to equality was first accepted as such in Canada and is now spreading throughout the world. And its idea, instead of formal equality, the substance of substantive equality is that it's predicated on promoting equality of historically disadvantaged groups on concrete grounds. That's not likes alike, unlikes unalike. It's a substantive, concrete, historical, transformation-oriented, change-defined approach. So sexual harassment's development also illustrates chaos theory's concept of orderly disorder in complex systems of non-linear dynamics, producing difficult-to-predict outcomes initiated from unexpected small places. Chaos, in other words, doesn't mean chaotic in the sense of lacking coherence or pattern. Complex patterns do emerge in what initially appeared to be patternless. I mean, now everybody's asking me, so how did we get to this moment with Harvey Weinstein being outed and all these women saying this? They're looking for the pattern in what had previously appeared patternless, and chaos theory regards the complexity of that and nonlinear causality's difficulty of prediction not as a failure of analysis, but actually as the analysis itself. And another example, an earlier one, is when the reaction to sexual harassment first elected Bill Clinton president. That is, political science found he was elected president as a result of American women's response to how Professor Anita Hill was treated in the hearing on her allegations of unwanted sexual initiatives by Clarence Thomas, who was put on the U.S. Supreme Court after that hearing. And then we saw sexual harassment's understandings resulting in Bill Clinton's impeachment. Now, this was certainly unexpected, at least by him, and I don't think Harvey Weinstein saw this coming either. That we now have an admitted sexual predator in the White House in the United States also shows chaos theory's orderly disorder. It also shows the persistence of reigning misogyny and white supremacy, among other things. But what we are also, I think, in part seeing is women's backlash to that. So why has sexual harassment law made actual social change? I think it strongly illustrates chaos theory's central notion of sensitivity to initial conditions. This is in chaos theory called sensitive dependence in systems of, again, nonlinear, non-mechanical. I'm saying law is not a linear system. Law is not a mechanical system. It's a system of human dynamics that are complex, in which in particular even the smallest shift in conditions at the beginning, such as the facts in particular cases, or certainly the choice of doctrine, can produce dramatic changes in the long term. Because it's neither linear nor mechanical, I actually think the common law can be a promising sphere of application of this method of complex repetition through embrace of changing realities and its rule of precedent combined. A single breakthrough, iterated through many variations, can open a complex tide in a distinctive direction. This is different from legislation, folks, right? I'm talking the common law now. Even as the precedential system, obviously, in the common law, will resist the initial breakthrough because there's no precedent there. So for agents of social change acting consciously, knowing that extremely small initial conditions can be amplified over time through systemic repetition to ultimately radically shift the way a system behaves. This is the risk. It's the caution because you could get it wrong, right? But it's also the hope. The point here, I mean, my takeaway from this part is that setting things up right from the beginning is absolutely crucial. You have to be there. It helps very much to be there at the beginning. Sexual harassment as a legal claim for sex discrimination, for example, faced the fact that the domain is sexual. Like, nobody wanted to do this. I'm here to tell you, nobody wanted to argue this case, which is why I got to do it. Nobody wanted to write this brief, which is why I got to do it. And so we got to say that it was sexual, which no one wanted to say. And that means that it is gender-based. That argument had never been done, never been made, never been thought about. And it was an interpretive argument of a prohibition on sex discrimination, which had never been used this way. The reason, not only that it was argued like this, but that I think it actually is crucial that it was argued this way, is that sexual harassment actually is sexual. That is what the behavior is, and it is actually gender-based, within a gender hierarchy. It is not, for example, a personal individual tort that the legal system might have more easily digested, but actually people had tried that, and the courts didn't understand what they were talking about, and also individual women were not believed. You didn't get to call them women in a tort case, because that's a group-based claim, right? So those weren't working. It wouldn't work for victims, at least not in the way that it has. Hence, it would not work for social change the way it has. I mean, Harvey Weinstein did not commit individual torts on all those women. He sexually harassed them because he was a man and they were women, and his sexuality has to do with his open bathrobe and potted plants. I mean, presumably you've all read all this. When the problem is, however, located legally, is what I'm saying, in the domain that the problem actually lives in social reality, it means that the legal claims, once you win, will repeatedly succeed because the evidence for those claims will support the legal theory. Like, how hard is this? I mean, it seems to be very difficult because there's a huge resistance out there to doing this. But if you actually predicate your legal theory on life in reality and put that into law, one of the things law is good at is evidence. So then, when you bring the evidence will support the legal theory, and you're there. Now, sure enough, over legal and political ups and downs across cultures, the basic paradigm of sexual harassment law as sex discrimination, and this includes, in India, all over the place, sometimes combined with other concepts, has held, changing society and politics at least to some degree, as well as law, opening courts to survivors, defining sexual harassment for people as not just life, as not just something we have to live with. The outcome also extends, as this one has, for example, to settings when there is no legal case at all. Something to notice about all of these reports of what was done by the sexual harassers, of whom there is yet another big prominent white man, his head rolling on a daily basis, back in the United States in particular, what you notice is there's not a legal case in sight. They're getting all kinds of what would be called relief, namely actions that white men are taking against white men. What they're doing is withdrawing their money from them in droves, withdrawing their books, their television shows, their magazines, their jobs, their careers. This is called voluntary compliance, people. You know, one of the things you get when you have a legal system that has some legitimacy is people actually, you don't have to bring a legal case. People actually comply with the norms, and these norms apparently have gotten to a place where what was a privilege of power has turned into such a total disgrace that these very prominent white men don't want to be associated with these guys. I mean, this has never been seen in the history of the world. So, I mean, I don't think it's at all unique to the United States. It's just a matter of keeping at it and getting up ahead of steam to where you change what was a privilege of power into a total disgrace. I mean, when BMW withdrew its money from Fox News based on Bill O'Reilly's exploits, you could have knocked me over with a feather. I'm just astounded. I'm like, why? You know, but it isn't up to me, it's up to them. You know, we made them do this, but we didn't force them to do it. We just created a context in which, finally, they saw that this was necessary. What happens when you do this is you change society and politics as well as law. In this example, the outcome has also extended, for instance, from women to men. One of the first things we did is make sure that when men sexually harass men, that's also included in the understanding that it is gender-based. As I said, men also have gender. And if you can show as a fact that it is gender-based, then you have a claim for discrimination for men. It is also in the process in the U.S., this argument of being extended to gay and lesbian rights as such, not just sexual harassment against gays and lesbians or people who they think are, but actually as a foundation for gay and lesbian rights per se. In other words, discriminating against someone based on being gay or lesbian is coming to be recognized as a form of sex discrimination in U.S. courts based on these cases, based on sexual harassment cases. So the concept of gender-based discrimination as sexual is then extending to all forms, I mean, in housing and employment, in all forms of discrimination to which that can be applied. And also along another route, the same argument has applied to transgender rights in some leading cases in the United States. We'll see what happens, and in administrative rulings, powerful ones as well. Now, the reason all this was possible is because this particular wing flap selected the right domain. Now, essential then for accessing this dynamic is calling problems in law what they actually are in life. Rape as torture, another thing that I just proposed at a conference, an international conference, became established in international law at warp speed in this same way. And actually evidence is indicating that the more human rights prosecutions there are in places that use torture, including rape, the less torture there is in those environments, the less instances of it there are. Another instance is the international definition of rape in the Akayesu case in the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda, which adopted a definition of rape that goes, Rape is a physical invasion of a sexual nature under conditions which are coercive. Period. End. You will note that the notion of consent is so irrelevant in that context as not to require being mentioned. This Akayesu definition has survived repeated attempts to ignore it internationally. It has been incorporated into the elements of crimes at the ICC, that is the International Criminal Court, and is expanding its reach. I'll talk a little more about this consent idea in the rape context shortly. The development of the concept of gender crime in general on the international stage, where it is now accepted at the International Criminal Court, is another illustration. And I'm also able to inform you that gangs in the Congo follow its results. So substantive equality doctrine in the constitutional law of Canada illustrates another chaos theory notion, and that is that the specific tolerance built into nonlinear processes promotes course correction. One theorist of chaos theory said this: simply put, a linear process, given a slight nudge, tends to remain slightly off track. A nonlinear process, given the same nudge, tends to return to its start point. Now, this is great. Remaining slightly off track is a charitable description of most attempts to make equality law actually work for equality in most places, and the United States is certainly a good example of that. Think of it as if you've ever tiled a room. You start with your tiles. You know, it's a linear process. If you're a little bit off at the outset, by the end, you know, you're going to have a completely skewed set of tiles, and you yourself will be in a corner. Okay. This is how linear processes work. The Supreme Court of Canada, however, originally accepted substantive equality's theory that inequality is hierarchy in historic disadvantage, which it then applied in cases actually that I was involved in litigating to hate propaganda law and to in pornography cases. That court then sort of wandered off in the wilderness for a couple of decades, using the old formal equality abstract sameness difference model roughly under the name of the new substantive equality one. To put it simply, for people with a philosophical background, having escaped the clutches of Aristotle, they fell into the grip of Kant. Dignity is what they decided was what inequality is really all about. Actually, it's only part of it and leaves a lot out. For example, dignity, according to Kant actually, is non-commensurable, meaning you can't get financial relief for it. Well, look, if you have unequal pay on the basis of sex, for example, I suppose that affects your dignity. But what about the money? Right? You're entitled to actual compensation for that and for a lot of other such injuries. So the dignitary issues that, I mean, what I think it was is that upper class white men have been breaking their brains trying to figure out what inequality is really about, when in fact it is not the world's biggest mystery to people who are subjected to it. And suddenly they thought, dignity, oh, now we finally understand it. You know? And it was okay to see that dimension of it, but the idea to reduce everything of inequality to that proved to be highly problematic, difficult to prove, did not fit the actual facts of the cases that were coming before them, including of First Nations people. However, the Canadians then, and here's my point here, proved capable of course correction. That is, they return to the original breakthrough, that is, the realization that inequality is all about hierarchy. And indignity is just one measure of the status damage that hierarchy does. So, and they said, sorry, we didn't really mean it. We don't mean that everybody has to prove a dignitary injury in order to have an equality claim. We just wanted a slight philosophical elevation, a bit of an enhancement to our original understanding, and referred to the original breakthrough and brought it all back I'm just saying this is the kind of course correction possibility that you have if you adopt this approach. However, linear strategies, if you're using a linear strategy and you're not engaging the existing power dynamics, and this sameness difference business is one of them, you're conceding existing power structures, so you're going to keep repeating them. And you're going to proceed ever more determinately to no equality destination. By contrast, a nudge that engages a nonlinear process consciously, if it was started in the right way, can actually change it. So the legal theory of social change that emerges from all this is not simply deterministic, as much legal realism would have it, nor is it cynically despairing, as much critical legal theory could lead you to think. Traditional theories, that is realism, old and new, public choice theory, or pluralism, for example, tend to be reductionist, linear, unreflective of social complexity, and unadapted to the substantive realities of male dominance. They spend a lot of time bemoaning what they call unintended consequences, which is the conventional takedown of any attempts to do anything. This, I think, is asking the wrong question. Consequences, of course, you have to carefully consider them. But believing you can control them all, or if you can't make a single move, reveals an unrealistic, mechanistic, and linear illusion about the nature of social life, of legal change, and of political activism. Now, I've seen actually few, if any, I've tried to think about this, negative consequences of my work, that is, consequences one did not intend or anticipate. But such consequences would only truly surprise a person who never tried to do anything big or real. By capturing practice in motion, this butterfly political analysis then opens on to some complex perceptions and deep understandings in the moments that they are unfolding. It begins to explain how some changes can be ongoing, ready to erupt, given sufficient momentum or a break, as with, and also, I think, for example, with the issue of pornography, even when, in that particular case, the inequality that it challenges has blocked the realization of the change. Exposing patterns where none were visible, I think this theory can help reveal why certain arguments are persuasive, some strategies have worked, some changes have seemingly come out of nowhere to suddenly be everywhere. For instance, one of these, in addition to the sexual harassment example, is the Nordic model on prostitution, which I call also the equality model, which penalizes the buyers and the sellers, that is, the buyers being the demand for it, and the sellers being the pimps and the traffickers, and eliminates any penalties for the sold, that is to say, the prostituted people in the industry. It was proposed out of the pornography work in 1990 in Sweden, passed in 1999, and it has virtually eliminated sex trafficking in that country and massively reduced prostitution by supporting prostituted people who want to leave prostitution, which by international measures is 92% of them when asked, what do you most need? Spontaneous answer, to leave prostitution, but I don't know how. So by supporting them in doing that, in the countries that have adopted this, which in addition to Sweden are Norway, Iceland, Northern Ireland, Republic of Ireland, Canada, and France so far, and it's being considered actively now in Israel, Cuba, Colombia, and South Africa. All of this success is despite very well-funded sex industry opposition, much of it funded by George Soros, actually. It is the model championed by the organization APNEAP in India. The butterfly politics analysis, I think, is thus not intended or offered to apply to everything that has complicated dynamics, but it isn't intended to be limited exclusively to sex inequality either, but rather as perhaps a useful heuristic beginning with other settings of inequality, but possibly other issues as well. So some of these initiatives that I've undertaken, I've been talking about, in the past 40 years have pretty much happened, meaning they're all moving in the right direction, which is, say, sexual harassment law, although it could be implemented better, and there could be more public understanding of it. And another example is the law of rape as a weapon in genocide, which first emerged from its chrysalis, I guess you would say, in the case of Kadic against Karadzic, the first time the idea was litigated. And 4 Muslim and Croat women who were sexually assaulted in the Serb-led genocide in Bosnia, we won $745 million for rape as an act of genocide and got the idea recognized. It was then recognized in the ad hoc tribunals, that is the Rwanda Tribunal and the Yugoslav Tribunal to some extent, and also under the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court. Now, all these interventions have been deeply imprinted, that I've mentioned, by their context, that is to say, the people who needed them. This one especially by Bosnian and Herzegovinian Muslim and Croat women, by their resistance to this genocide. What we've also done is expose the role of rape in past genocides and are working that it will never be invisible again. Some changes are in an ongoing process of being progressively accomplished, such as the Nordic model on prostitution. It, like all this work, is based on the experiences, needs, demands of survivors, who initiated all of them and produced the worldwide movements around them all. Some of these undertakings, such as the pornography work, remain embattled in near stasis, even if tectonic shifts may be gathering down deep, and this illustrates the contingency aspect. But you will notice that anything from the pornography work in which a civil claim for harms to human rights was proposed, along with an accurate definition, anything from that work is even more true today, and even more urgent today than it was in the 1980s. Especially, we see the silencing effect of the pornography itself, justified widely in the name of expression. Even as survivors of abuse have continued to speak out about it. And also, even as we see a pornographic sexuality being central to the way sexual harassment takes place, particularly by those in the entertainment industry. Now, one place where a certain butterfly effect is just beginning is the law of rape. And while the international definition of rape in the Akayesu case and in the ICTR is based on coercion, as I said, consent being irrelevant, domestic laws of rape haven't recognized this, and they typically turn on consent. So I would just like to observe that making consent central to rape law, despite attempts to reclaim it by some activists, is what puts the victim on trial. It is why the centrality of consent to rape law is why the British conviction rate, with its all-consent law, is an appalling 6.3% of cases prosecuted. Consent as a concept is rooted in the active-passive model of sex as being something that someone with more power does to someone with less, and it is thoroughly sex stereotyped. It is given its fullest expression in the political theory by actually white British men in the 17th and 18th centuries. That political theory justifies rulers in ruling the ruled. Consent means acquiescence, whether or not a choice is real. It means being rolled by power. If you read all the accounts of the women who said they were sexually harassed by Harvey Weinstein, and then you see him saying he had no non-consensual sex, ask yourself what it would mean if legally he was accurately describing those interactions. What I'm telling you is that any time, and this is a good 2/3 of them, the women say, you know, he shoved me against the wall, da-da, you know, and then I just gave up. I just gave up is consent in law. So it means being rolled by power. It's an intrinsically unequal concept, even when it works the way it is supposed to work. By contrast, for instance, the international law of sex trafficking, which survivors of prostitution call serial rape, prohibits sexual exploitation in, and this is a quote, circumstances of abuse of power or conditions of vulnerability. Consent by statute. This is the Palermo Protocol, which even the United States has signed, okay? But it's all over the world, right? I mentioned because the United States, you know, is a international outlaw, generally speaking, and even signed this thing. But by statute, under the Palermo Protocol, consent is irrelevant if conditions of vulnerability or abuse of power producing sexual exploitation have been used. And this has been the case actually internationally in sex trafficking law since 1949 at least. So notice that sexual harassment law does not have a consent standard. It has a welcomeness standard, which is an entirely different notion. Inequality, I'm saying, is not consented to. Accepting unequal pay doesn't make it equal. Rape is a crime of inequality. Consent needs to come out of rape law. Domestic laws of rape need to be based on coercion, reconfiguring definitions of force to extend beyond physical force, although to include it, to all the forms of inequality that make rape possible, including race, class, caste, sexual orientation, gender identity, disability is a big one, and age is huge, as well as gender stereotypes, when all of these inequalities are actively deployed in the sexual interaction to get the drop on someone. I mean, this is what makes rape possible. Now, so in case you're wondering what there is left to do besides pornography and rape, and more on prostitution, there is the continued virtually total impunity for sexual abuse of children. Arguably the foundational practice, I think, of the whole gender system. Sexual abuse in childhood, I think, is ground zero for sex inequality, but its butterfly moments haven't even started to take off. It is sexual abuse of children is the foundation of prostitution and sex trafficking, in that most people used in prostitution either were sexually abused as children or enter prostitution as children. And that is true here, it is true worldwide. Both children and most prostituted people sustain serial rape and molestation under which they have no real options. That is what sexual abuse in childhood is, being molested under circumstances in which you have no real options. It is also what rape and sexual harassment and prostitution are all about, namely sex being forced on someone who has less power by someone with more. That is the dynamic of sexual abuse in childhood, and it is played out, again, in sexual harassment, in rape, sexual harassment in education, a lot, as well as employment, and in prostitution. And it is also the dynamic that pornography sexualizes. And also, many, if not most, rapists were sexually abused themselves as children. To escape it being done to them, which is a choice they are given if they grow up to be men, many men become masculine. That is, sexualizing power over others. The idea is you can either do it or have it done to you. Actually, there's another option. You don't have to do it. Right? To survive under this, girls are taught to acquiesce in femininity. We're taught to sexualize power over us. So sexual abuse in childhood explains more about the gender system, that is, more about male violence, meaning violence, and more about sexual politics, meaning politics, than any other single thing does. If you put all the studies together, for instance, being sexually abused in childhood affects about half of the girls in the United States in contact forms before we reach the age of majority, and at least a quarter of boys. And I think that's a low number. And all for the boys. The studies are much less good of the boys. And although some valiant steps have been made against this, in some institutional forms, for example, virtually nothing is being done about it, despite laws against it. Now, you may have all been taught that Blackstone said, I mean, what this is all headed is a realizing the breadth and the scope of these injuries. We have Blackstone telling us, better 10 perpetrators go free than one innocent accused suffer from a conviction, as if these were alternatives. Actually, with sexual assault, we've got quite a lot of both. Some innocent people being convicted, but it isn't only 10 perpetrators going free. With the real numbers, 10 to 1 is way, way low as an estimate. So all this, as it illustrates, it's not an individual dynamic. If a cyclone eventuates, it's collective. Each initiative begins with a survivor's life, called narrative in some fancy scholarship, facts actually, in cases, about which essentially nothing was being done, called impunity by me, followed by the first perturbations predicated on a relationship between the survivor, organizers, advocates who were awake, who were paying attention, and actually judges who are listening. It unsettles the waters in what appeared to be an isolated local setting, a small place, such as the original proposal of the Human Rights Ordinance against pornography, or the public interest litigation in Bihar that was brought by prostituted women for real police protection, and won. And as a result, traffickers are being arrested, some of them are being jailed, so they're not trafficking their daughters today. It's an isolated location, a place close to home, and a cause of action for the specific injuries that were brought has a real victim's face. If the survivors trust you, is what I'm saying, there's very little that you can't accomplish. So one major lesson here is that law's power to make change, and with this it's recognizing sexual abuse as sex discrimination, which had never happened before, and underlies all these initiatives, does not come from law's place in the existing order of power, the way people think. Actually, that, if anything, is what resists making these changes. The power to change comes from law's location in social life, that is, what it means to people, the meanings that we give it, even people who aren't equal under it, even when law doesn't deserve the meanings that they invest in it. It can change reality, in other words, not because of its place in the established structure of force or authority, or because actually it creates precedence that is binding on other cases. And it isn't because, as a vehicle of state power, it can impose itself on life. It can change reality because people believe in it, including people that it hasn't represented. Listen, if prostituted women in Bihar can believe in it enough to try to use it, anybody in this country can. If people didn't believe that it could represent them against their experience, including to try to get the police to actually provide protection for them, given that the police have in the past provided mainly protection for the upper caste gangs of men who are buying and violating them, if they can, against all odds and despite that experience, find it to be an instrument for them, that's why it works for change. If they didn't think that, if people didn't believe in it, it wouldn't work for change, or actually it wouldn't work at all. It's why even a small percentage of women report their rapes to the legal system. It's why they feel vindicated when the law believes them. It's why they feel shattered when it doesn't. It's also, in a sense, why today they're going to social media, both out of hope and desperation in the legal system, a combination of that. It's not naivete or blind trust or an illusion of they live in a just world. Comes out of a determination to stand and fight for themselves and, even more so, for others like them. With an inkling that, and this is very much the Me Too dynamic, these are women who aren't willing to see other women just twist in the wind all by themselves out there. And all of a sudden, after 2 hours, there's 500,000 of them standing with each other. So the idea is that, I mean, it's all predicated on, it never would have happened if law hadn't been part of the process, if sexual harassment hadn't been legally recognized, with an insistence that law represent women and people like them for a change, as it supposedly gets its legitimacy from doing. What I think we're seeing here is that, I mean, I didn't used to think that substance was the key to process, and now I do. The main lesson learned from practice on the ground here on how to produce social change for women through legal activism is that the who and the what are absolutely crucial to the how. That is, content, the specific content of each situation, its location, concretely in the structure of the whole, is the key to strategy. In trying to move the plate tectonics of this world, content tells you where to insert your lever, what is big and what is small, what matters, what doesn't, what is cause, what is effect, and actually what the context is. In other words, the substance of the political analysis of the reality is what it is makes the legal strategy effective. In other words, the power of political law for women comes less from the law than from the women and the politics. And my suspicion is that this is the case for a lot of systemic change. Substance is why talking reality to judges about sexual assault is effective when it is exposed to the light of day, having been almost entirely covered up. And this is what you see on the Me Too hashtag. Sexual assault looks like what it is. It looks denigrating, devastating, destructive, denying of humanity of the victim, being defended usually as if the perpetrator has a right to do it. Substance is why the legal work on sexual harassment, genocidal rape, pornography, prostitution, sex trafficking, and this is true whether we win or lose, actually. The substance of it is why that work has been empowering, transnationally, as well as domestically, to survivors and to groups of people of which the survivors are members. And it is actually substance that is the reality of gender hierarchy that law is most designed to keep out of court. So actually getting that in there allows what law's power to change by restoring a piece of the humanity that the victimization took away. It isn't that it provides compensation, because it's never enough, and it isn't that it locks someone up, because sometimes that helps, but actually it does very little good and a lot wrong. But restoring a piece of one's humanity is something that courts do and can do. This piece of wholeness and hope for it, this is the power that lawyers for violated people, whether they are wrongfully convicted or rightfully vindicated, hold in their hands. So, you know, on its life journey, a butterfly can die of lack of nutrition. In image, it can be fragile and vulnerable. It can go smash against a windshield of a powerful machine. But still, these butterflies go from Mexico to Alaska and back, not the same one, but as a community, as a whole. So I say, equality seekers, spread your wings. You're a lot stronger than you know. And what butterflies can set in motion, sometimes even just one, cannot be stopped. Thank you.
We thank Professor MacKinnon for that inspiring and powerful lecture, and now invite Honorable Justice Rooma Pal to preside the question-answer session.
A little late. I'll just limit the question answer to 3 questions that Professor MacKinnon can answer. So has anyone got any questions? Yes? Could you give him a microphone, please? Please identify yourself and then ask the question.
Ma'am, given that a lot of your life's work has been dedicated to battling the subordination of women in pornographic industries, my question relates primarily to freedom of speech and how the First Amendment in the United States of America works. Given that the First Amendment was conceptualized as a bulwark that would defend the worst kinds of speech and not just the best kinds of it, given that Oliver Wendell Holmes, when he framed the idea, said that it's to defend the kind of speech that we ought to fear and loathe with death. When that's the idea behind defending freedom of speech, where do we draw the line in battling pornography but also defending the freedom of speech? Thank you.
Actually, the original idea behind the First Amendment and its implementation included a very clear understanding of power and powerlessness. It was people who truly had no power, who were anarchists, syndicalists, communists, real artists, actual writers, who were being hounded by the authorities, whose work was being censored, that the Supreme Court originally created the foundational structures and concepts of the First Amendment to protect. What then happened is the Nazis, the Ku Klux Klan, other white supremacists, the pornographers, other people who actually have power in American society because they speak for dominant interests, hijacked it and took it over and said, oh, we're the ones truly with little power. Please protect us. And the liberals on the Supreme Court couldn't tell the difference between people who truly had power and people who actually had it and were pretending not to in order to get the protection of dominant institutions. And so they've taken over the First Amendment. So you're wrong about, although many people say what you say, it's not like you don't have any footnotes for it, because of course you would. But I'm saying it's wrong as to its attribution of where the First Amendment originally came from. It was originally to protect people who didn't have a voice, who didn't have power, who couldn't fight back against the state subordinating them. And it's turned into being an instrument for the state to protect people who are subordinating other people, including through speech. So this where do you draw the line business, anytime you want to see our line, you can look at our definition of pornography, which is our line. Graphic, sexually explicit, subordination of women through pictures or words that also includes one of a list of specific concrete elements. And that material will get women raped. It will get children violated. It produces the sense that buying a woman for sex is a perfectly fine thing to do, acceptable. It normalizes all the abuse we've just been talking about. So that's where we draw that line. And it isn't at all ambiguous, and it is simply a description of what the pornography industry produces.
Another question. Anyone else with a question? Oh my goodness.
Hello. Excuse me, ma'am.
Sorry, could you start again? Yeah, I'm Dr. Shashikala Gupur. I'm the Dean of Symbiosis Law School, Pune. My question is about the logical consistency, which is very, very superb when the crime of rape was taken as torture, in order to bring it out of the sexualized context and put it on a kind of, if not gender neutral, but more on a human rights platform. But on the same logic, when we look at pornography, one of the arguments is that among the consumers of pornography there are women as well. Two, that pornography serves a kind of function which is gratifying in the media theories and other theories, the gratification of the audiences. Now from the feminist media studies point of view, it is gratifying by commoditizing the body of the woman. Now how do you view it when there are consumers who are women as well? I'm questioning the logical consistency in the approach based on the same logic where we took a neutral ground when it came to neutral and more asexualized ground of human rights. How do we do that when it comes to the pornography debate? I mean, that's where I am lost when I follow through. Thank you.
Rape as torture as a legal claim works not because it is not sexualized, but because of the limitations on the way the law of torture internationally is generally interpreted to apply to state activities. And there's some parts of the torture convention that you could potentially use to apply to pornography studios, for example. And that's what they're doing. They're torturing people in those. And a lot of it includes rape and other forms of sexual assault. But passing that application, and that I guess you'd call creative interpretation of the International Torture Convention, the point of it is that there was Amnesty International, which for decades was working against torture, but didn't official torture in societies in which people were being rounded up and kept impounded, and it saw itself as its mission as getting them out, but never saw that the rape was part of that. And that was both inaccurate and outrageous. It basically says women aren't human down there. When you're sexually violated, that's some other thing than a violation of your humanity. So as you said, it puts it in a human rights framework, but I think it doesn't do so at the cost of desexualizing it. It does it at the cost of recognizing the sexualization of torture through rape as one means of it. But it definitely does put it in a human rights context, and in the process recognize the humanity of what had previously not been considered a human attribute because it was attributed only to women. That is sexuality. We are sex. We are the sex. Okay. Men apparently don't have any in this. Okay. So on the subject of pornography, the fact that it gratifies the consumer is why it exists. That's where the money comes from. The fact that people who are consuming it are enjoying consuming it doesn't mean that the people who are violated to make it aren't being violated. It's the first thing to notice. And it also doesn't mean that people who are in the environment of the people who are consuming the pornography aren't also being harmed as a result. The data and the experimental investigations, as well as all the social science on it, is completely unambiguous. By the way, don't believe the lies you hear put out by PR firms paid well by the pornography industry, that the empirical evidence on the subject of harm due to pornography is ambiguous. It's not. It could not be clearer. If you want to see a good review of it, by the way, a PhD student in Sweden named Max Waltman, W-A-L-T-M-A-N, has done an excellent review of the evidence on the harms of production and the harms through consumption in a dissertation on the website of Stockholm University in political science. So I'm saying it's at her expense, this gratification. But so far, all that matters is that he wants it and is gratified by it, not the fact she pays for it, so it's at her expense. Now, the idea of women consumers is a large ambition of the pornography industry. They have wanted to double their profits for some time. And if they really could convince us all that women, if they could figure out how to tap into the woman market, they would make even more money than they already do, which is in the many thousands of dollars per second, changing hands. Not the pornographers, the sex industry as a whole, of which they're a part. So, first of all, there's a large, again, PR machine out there trying to convince you that women are as interested in this as men, etc. They're not. For whatever reasons. I think actually that men are pressed and conditioned to have an objectified sexuality, to objectify sexually. Women are pressed and conditioned to be objectified sexually, so that us actually consuming things as sex. Whatever it is. If people are out there having sex with their computer screen, okay, that is what you're doing, okay? And it's a thing. No one is there, okay, except you, okay? And so I just mean to point out that so far, in general, it has not succeeded to sexualize the relation between a person and a thing for women. So far, that has yet to occur. It always could. Some women it has. Just as there really are men out there who don't want to have sex with things. They actually, it didn't work on them. They actually want to be intimate with another human being and see their sexuality as part of that. So just as these pressures don't fully construct the dominant group, they don't fully construct the subordinated group either. And, so no doubt there will be some women who will model their sexuality on domination. And this also could even be a response to having been dominated sexually. The responses go both ways. So, I don't find it confusing at all. It's a complex dynamic. It is about top-down sexuality. It is not biological. It is entirely social. And the real miracle is that not all women sexualize subordination and not all men sexualize dominance. That's the miracle in the picture.
Next questioner. The next questioner. Yes.
Okay. Thank you, ma'am, for the wonderful lecture. My question is regarding your suggestion regarding, the definition of rape. So, the way you portrayed, it seemed that you are suggesting that the idea of consent should be simply removed from the definition of rape, and it should be decided on the basis of physical abuse, including physical injury. If I have taken it correctly, you may correct me on this. So my question here is, what about the classic case where it's a case of undue influence where the superior is dominating the mind of the inferior, and the act is non-consensual, but at the same time, there's no physical injury as such. To continue to that, there's one more concern where, at times it becomes difficult to differentiate something like consensual act with non-consensual act, especially in the era where, something like 50 Shades of Grey is one of the best sellers of the world. I'm talking about cases of sadomasochism, where people are coming and even talking about individual autonomy and those kind of things on the ground of violation of privacy and others. So the whole idea is that in the absence of actual physical violence, and if you remove this idea of consent, how to take call on whether it is a case of rape or it is not a case of rape. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much. I have, and actually I've written a statute for it, and it can be found in the Harvard Journal of Law. It's the Harvard Law and Policy Review of the summer of 2016. It's called Rape Redefined, the article. It's the 50-page version of which the very short argument appears in Butterfly Politics. That's sort of the elevator version, 12 minutes of, just laying this whole idea out. But the lengthy one with the footnotes and everything, as well as the statutory proposal, is in the Harvard Law and Policy Review. It is written precisely for what you said. That is, so that the people with the most power, rather than the least, are targeted by the law. So when you say a classical case of a dominating male over a subordinated female, it's a question of what is the basis for that dominance. And all the inequalities that I mentioned are what define coercion under this law. So if it's a workplace hierarchy, if it's a racial hierarchy or a caste hierarchy, whatever it is that is then used for dominance, not just that it exists, right, but that it is used for dominance, and typically along with gender, but not exclusively gender differences, but often there is gender involved even if people are of the same sex. If a rape is being claimed by someone, that's my idea of how to solve that. That is, you are still limiting it to physical force. I'm not. As you say, no violence. I'm talking about inequality as the basis for a rape law. Okay, 1. 2, as to sadism, masochism, etc., do you want to respond to that? No. I think the Vice Chancellor is saying this isn't going to happen. Anyway, I did answer that first question. And as to the S&M part, as to sadism and masochism, etc., that is the sexualization of hierarchy. I mean, these at least are people who are not lying about what it is the foundation of the sexuality that they practice. And in order for there to be a claim for anything, somebody would have to say they were raped or violated or hurt. In other words, the so-called safe word was violated, which, by the way, a lot is. And so it doesn't shift those practices per se, so far as to say that if one is sexualizing inequality, that someone who is in that picture would be having to say that they were coerced, as opposed to simply, engaging in a sexuality that is the sexuality that they choose to have. So this is saying that the sexuality of inequality is unequal and is a serious issue. And it takes a position that is contrary to the valorization of S&M as a form of sexual practice. At the same time, it does nothing to legally target that in any way more than it already is, at least in some places.
There are more questions. Professor MacKinnon is very happy to answer those questions, but unfortunately I, as moderator, have to leave Calcutta on a prior engagement. I'm very sorry about that. So we have two alternatives. One is that the Vice Chancellor takes over as the moderator.
That's fine.
That's fine. So there you are. So I'm sorry that I cannot continue because that was a wonderful interaction. Thank you very much, Professor MacKinnon. And I hope you will forgive me for having to leave.
Absolutely.
I'll just hand over this to the Vice Chancellor.
Yes. Yes.
I think the Vice Chancellor would first like to present the memento to Professor MacKinnon with Honorable Justice Rumapal. So may we please have the felicitation.
Presentation of the memento and then okay. I'm sorry. Nice.
Yes. I will also join.
Session with Professor Bhatt as moderator, and for further questions there will be a session with NUJS students and faculty on Monday with Professor MacKinnon as well.
I don't disagree with any of that, and it's completely obvious that judges have a role in this. What I'm talking about is they can't do very much until and unless the realities are presented to them.
Exactly.
And for that to happen, the people who are affected by it have to believe in them enough to do it, or they have to have the tools that make that possible. You have to give judges those tools. You have to give them also those facts and those realities. And what I've found is the whole legal system is largely designed to keep that out. And it's an amazing fight to get it in. This substantive equality argument's never been argued in the United States. Not in a single case. Really, there's been some recognition of it by judges in racial contexts a while back. And, they're unrolling that now every minute. So, yeah, that's obvious. The judges
process is going on, therefore.
No, but they're big actors in it and everything. It's just that I'm talking about the people as actors in it, but also the larger social context around them that creates them, but also creates the actual social change. In other words, they don't create the change. You know, they can do things and recognize things and have a powerful voice in it. But actually, they aren't the ones that are making the change. And it's the change that comes into them and the change that goes out from them that is the social change.
Yes,
and so that's what I'm here to talk about.
Thank you.
Yes, persons who ask questions can keep their questions very short. Only questions, not comments or interventions. Okay, please.
Two quick questions, if I may be permitted. But my first question is, how do you look at the role of heterosexual, heteronormative men in this process for social change of eradication of gender inequality? Especially your take on Engage with Men, which is the worldwide quote-unquote movement that is on. So what is the role of men in all of this? And my second question is, if we were to sort of, if I may be permitted to talk about your work, there's been a shift from recognizing or looking at the state, any state, as a male apparatus, to having some kind of faith in the state and its legal system. I mean, that is how I perceive your work from the 70s till now. Your earlier works, which was looking at the male state apparatus, to an apparatus which is amenable to gender politics. So how do you look at your shift in your work, given that your basic jurisprudential basis has remained the same? Thank you.
As I see this movement, it is a politics. That means anyone can embrace it. And once the reality of one's situation is exposed and brought to light, anyone can see it if they've got their eyes open. And anyone, therefore, includes men. And the sexuality that they practice is, you know, of interest, but not determinative of whether they can adopt these politics. I mean, they are often in a very good position to see the realities and to oppose this form of subordination. That it isn't particularly in their interest is not my problem. You know, it's their problem. And, you know, but my view is anyone who wants to stand on my ground is welcome to do so. And I see no shift in my work whatsoever. It began as a critique of what is male about the state in 4 different legal areas, and in every single legal area I've done something about it. The whole point of pointing out how male-dominated it all was to change it. You know, but there are apparently some academics seem to be of the view that if you're critical of something that, you know, you're going to make your niche in life for the rest of your life by continuing to be critical of that thing. Well, some of us don't work that way. So there is no faith in the state. I don't have any faith in any of this. First of all, I've done a lot of international work, which is not about a state. Although it is unfortunately still very state-based. But secondly, it isn't about faith in anything. I mean, we have to be there because we don't have faith in it doing the right things without us. And, you know, empowering women to to speak out and have their voices actually heard in these settings is what this project is all about. Again, it isn't about faith. You know, it's about determination, you know, to make have these institutions respond to all of us who live here. We live here too, right? That's all this is. And it says, you know, the ways in which we are violated are unacceptable and need to be addressed. So, and as I say, you know, if prostituted women in Bihar can think enough that their voices could be heard to get them heard in the legal system, you know, then that wasn't because they had faith in it. Why should they have faith in anything? You know, they're the people who should have the least faith in it. But no, they have some faith in themselves and in our work together and a belief in their own humanity to stand up for it, you know, including in institutions that haven't been built to listen to them and insist that they be listened to. So that's what it's about, and that's what it's been about from the beginning, and it's what it's about now.
There can be only one question, last question. Because on Monday also there will be one interactive session where students can participate. Yes, that is the last question, short question. Okay.
Okay, now it's working. Raya Sarkar made a list. Raya Sarkar, an Indian attorney in the US, made a list of prominent men in Indian academia or Indian men in academia across the globe who, like basically, were said to be sexual harassers. When we speak about using the law to, to further social change, but often we observe that for women and for queer bodies and for trans individuals, these institutional mechanisms that have been established are deeply ineffectual. So how best do we react to the argument that the other side states, like the due process argument? How do we react to that? Because clearly we are not following any due process in publishing such a list, but it is necessary for people who have survived this harassment to state it as well. So how do we best counter the due process argument is what I'd like to ask.
I'm sorry, when I first heard you speak of it, I thought you were talking about a list relative to Indian men in the United States. But no, you're talking about the list made here of Indian male academics, yeah. As I understand it, some of what those individuals were being accused of doing was described there, but quite a lot of it wasn't. And so it seemed to me quite a good point that, one of the reasons that the discussion has worked in the United States is that journalists have been very careful to describe in real detail, even if they have withheld the identities of the accusers, and in some cases of the accused, but typically of the accusers, to describe in real detail what it was they were said to have done. This is a kind of social form of due process because it you can't confront an accusation if you don't know what it is. And so simply having a name show up on a list can be problematic when you don't know what you are, if you're the person accused, you don't know what you're accused of having done. So while the processes, the internal processes of institutions definitely need improvement, and they need to be much more responsive. I mean, I work a lot with sexual harassment in education, and the schools do, in general, a terrible job of dealing with it. And mostly their view is that the persons who were accused of sexual harassment, they're on their side, in essence. And so that's typically the case, especially when it's faculty, and sometimes also when it's students, students being sexually harassing or raping other students. And so we've had to put a lot of work into attempting to, I mean, all this due process talk about those processes are mainly further defenses of accused violators who actually are receiving due process, in many cases, much more than the survivors are receiving. And what people are asking for when they're making all this due process whining is criminal standards of due process. And as I've had to point out to some of my colleagues, not being able to attend Harvard is a severe sanction, but it is not the same as being put in jail. Okay, that's also a joke, by the way. And so, I mean, sexual harassment is a civil claim. Arises under a guarantee of equality in educational opportunity, and thus calls for civil process, not criminal process. So the civil process is being provided by any number of schools. The schools that haven't provided it, either for the accused or for the victim, need to be called out on that, because we need that. But all this noise about no due process, particularly in the educational environment, is really about a rearguard attempt to put criminal standards in to civil process, thus, in essence, to make it impossible to do anything about sexual assault. I mean, the reason we have sexual harassment law is because rape law doesn't work. And, you know, so all we need now is to put all that, you know, back in to the human rights structure. So, you know, that said, I mean, it's the reason you know, you might be wondering, why does everybody go to social media instead of going to the courts? Answer, because of the way courts treat people. Also, because the statute of limitations is the shortest in the world for anything. It's 180 days. Find me another law that has a statute of limitation of 180 days. You know, it just goes poof after that, disappears. You know what statute of limitations is? The injury is gone. You can't do anything about it anymore legally. That's why they're not in court, for the most part. And also because when they tried to report it at the time, they tried to report it of the ways they were treated. And this is true in employment, it's true in education, and so on. So that's why they're doing social media. But actually, the lack of due process is a claim, is something. I want to know, where are all the girls who have been defending, I call them girls, anyway, they're adult women. Girls, come on, defend Harvey Weinstein. Let's hear it. Stand up for this man. Hello? Is that an echo of silence I hear? You know, apparently it does not promote people's, you know, careers and opportunities to stand up for Harvey Weinstein at this moment in time. So they're not. They're silent. They're not saying his due process rights have been violated. But actually, you know, all these sanctions that are being visited on all these men, and there are a lot of them now, are things that we could never sue for in court because they aren't even available, even if the statute of limitations hadn't run. They are not part of any criminal case. You can't do any of those things in a civil case or a criminal case. So anybody who's got a due process problem, go talk to the head of the company who fired the guy. They're the ones who should be providing whatever process is going to be provided. Go talk to the head of Fox News, you know, for turfing out Bill O'Reilly. Go talk to the head of these studios and these boards of directors who have decided they cannot afford to be associated with these people. That's where the lack of due process is coming in, but it's coming in because there is no process in which to have something be due. You know, but they're the ones who are doing it. You know, we're not doing it. The victims aren't doing it. The people with the power to visit the sanctions are the ones who are doing it. So anyway, as just that said, when it comes to this list, my view is that it would be a good thing if more detail was provided. So at least people who are being accused of these activities, this behavior, would know what their accusers are accusing them of. Because it is, I mean, it's tough to see your name on there, and you should at least be told why. And in some cases it is there, and in some cases it's not.
Thank you.
Thank you, Professor MacKinnon, for patiently answering all our questions. Now we would like to invite Professor Anirban Majumdar to deliver the vote of thanks.
Professor Catharine MacKinnon, Professor Ishar Bhatt, judges of the High Court, academicians, all my colleagues and invited guests, ladies and gentlemen, my dear students. It's a lifetime opportunity for all of us to get to hear Professor Catharine MacKinnon. And it's an honor for me and privilege for me to come and offer this vote of thanks. On behalf of NUJS family, my deep regards and gratitude to Professor Catharine MacKinnon to take time out of her schedule and come to Kolkata and deliver this lecture. I believe many of us, we are taking points from this lecture to discuss and debate in the future. And I'm sure Professor Catharine MacKinnon will visit us again and we'll wait for that opportunity. We express our gratitude to you, ma'am, for coming here and spending time with us. Justice Rumapal had to leave for her prior engagement, but she has always been a constant source of inspiration for NUJS, and we look forward to her guidance again in future. I must put on record our deep regards and appreciation to Mr. K.K. Venugopal and his family for instituting this endowment and for being instrumental in inviting Professor MacKinnon here. I express my sincere thanks to our Vice Chancellor, who has always supported and encouraged us to conduct such program. And you can see in the campus there are multiple activities that are happening today. A program like this is impossible to conduct without the support of entire faculty and administrative personnel. So I thank each one of you. And then last but not the least, my all dear students for coming and participating in this lecture and converting this lecture into a conversation. Thank you very much. Thank you all.
Thank you everyone for attending. There will be refreshments in the lobby which you can help yourself with. Thank you.